Hi, Gigi. Come share an apple with me. I picked it fresh from Granny Smith's sinister tree. Don't mind my stories, you'll soon see. They're as dark and disturbing as they can be. Murmurs of secrets, bloody sodden crimes, Granny's bone-clicking tales will twist your mind. You'll be hanging on my words from the edge of your seats. Now how'd you like to go dig up some bodies with me? So go grab a shovel and gather around, 'cause 8 feet under is where they'll be found. This podcast contains detailed discussions of real-life crimes, which may include descriptions of violence, sensitive subject matter, and other potentially distressing content. Listener discretion is strongly advised. The material is intended for mature audiences only and may not be suitable for children or those who may find such topics triggering. Welcome back to 8 Feet Under, Granny Smith, where the fucking tea is hot and the stories are cold. I'm going to say that every damn time, every episode now, because it just gives me a giggle. I don't know why. So anyway, last night I was talking with my friend RA about the icebox murders from the last episode, and we both want or need to know more. We need answers to this fucking cold case. So we want to read that book, The Icebox Murders. It is fact-based fiction, but still, we want to read it and get sucked into that whole conspiracy theory thing. And maybe we could start a group. What is that? What's the name of that? Like when people who aren't in law enforcement or whatever, they kind of get together and actually help law enforcement solve like unsolved cases and stuff. Why can't I think of the fucking name of that network or the group? I don't know. Somebody tell me, or I'll Google it after. But to be honest, I might forget. So anyway, I'm getting super distracted already. So today's story was actually a suggestion slash request from my friend Spider. So shout out to Spider because this one is a good one. I don't really think I heard of this story, even though it's my hometown. So today, Granny has a story about a man who dressed like a monster and then turned out to be one. This is a tale of a man who cruised the streets of Phoenix, Arizona, dressed in a costume, posing for pictures with fans and police while hiding this kind of darkness that no one suspected. Go get your cup of joe and those bedazzled shovels so we could dig 8 feet into the story of Bryan Patrick Miller. Welcome to the Zombie Hunter, aka the Canal Killer. The sources I use for today are a 12 News article from June 2023 written by John Tannant, a July 2024 CBS News article written by Paul LaRose, and the rest will be in the show notes. So let's get to it. Bryan Patrick Miller was born in October of 1972, and he lived in Hawaii with both of his parents, but his dad died in a motorcycle accident when Bryan was still really young. Years after that, he and his mother Ellen moved to Phoenix, Arizona, and it seemed like he had a really tough childhood. His mom was a detention officer who was really abusive towards Bryan. And we'll get into the specifics of that a little bit later in the story. So jump to May of 1989 when Bryan was only 16. He was sentenced to a juvenile detention facility until he turned 18 after he pled guilty to stabbing a woman at Paradise Valley Mall. Bryan had been riding on the same bus as 24-year-old Celeste Bentley, who was on her way to work. So the two get off at the same bus stop. After they get off the bus, Celeste starts walking and Bryan is behind her, and all of a sudden he just starts running at her. So she thought that he hit her in the back. So she yells, quote, "Why? Why'd you do that?" End quote. But then when she touched her back, she realized she was bleeding and that he didn't hit her. He had actually stabbed her in her upper back. Somehow, she was able to make it to her job and her coworkers called 911. The emergency responders came, and then about 30 minutes later, while she was in the back of the ambulance, the police told Celeste that they found her attacker and they needed her to identify him. So she agrees, and then the police bring Bryan Patrick Miller to the ambulance where Celeste positively identifies him. While Bryan is sitting in juvie, his mom went through all his stuff and she found a note that he had written. The note was more of like a how-to or checklist of how he wanted to find, kidnap, rape, kill, and dismember women. And I'll upload a picture of the note that I found. I'll try to find a better one, but the one I was looking at, it's kind of hard to read and a lot of it's blurred out, but it does show part of this checklist. So number 1 says, kidnap the girl. Number 2, tie her up in the truck. Number 3, take her to the desert. Number 4, cut off her clothes. One of the CBS News articles does mention that part of the note describes how Bryan would decapitate someone, then preserve the head. Remember that part for later. So Brian's mom, Ellen, takes the note to the police and she lets him know that she won't allow him back in her home when he's released because she's in fear for her life. When Brian turns 18, he was released, but he was sent to a halfway house in Phoenix. So he gets released, he's in the halfway house, and then in the late 90s, Brian gets married to a young woman by the name of Amy. All right, let's talk about this whole zombie hunter persona. Brian was apparently very popular in the sci fi and cosplay world. He would walk around wearing a long ass trench coat, a helmet, goggles, and a Gatling gun. Yes, I had to look up what a Gatling gun is because I didn't know, and I'm going to give you the definition. So, a Gatling gun is a hand cranked, multi barreled firearm invented by Richard Gatling in 1862, which was the forerunner for the modern machine gun. Its design uses a cluster of rotating barrels, with each one being loaded and fired as it spins, allowing for a much faster rate of fire than a single barrel rifle of its time. You're welcome. Anyway, Brian also had a police car that he had souped up with fake blood, steampunk gear, and he had a fucking creepy ass mannequin in the back seat behind the bars of like the police car. And yes, I had to look up what steampunk gear is because I don't know shit about the cosplay world. I have no idea what any of that is. So the definition I got was steampunk gear is a subgenre of science fiction that incorporates retro futuristic technology and aesthetics prominently inspired by 19th century industrial steam powered machinery and design. Steampunk works are often set in an alternative history of the Victorian era or the American frontier where steam power remains in mainstream use, or in a fantasy world that employs steam power. That's the definition I got when I looked it up. If there's more to it or if it's different, let me know. If it's wrong, argue with the milkman. I don't know. Moving on. So Brian says that this whole zombie hunter persona made him feel like he was being noticed and less invisible. He was in parades, took pictures with fans, smiled with kids, signed autographs, and among his quote unquote fans were police officers who would line up waiting to take pictures with him. And Brian apparently liked to collect those pictures that he took with police as if they were some sort of trophy. People were intrigued by Brian. They loved his whole zombie hunter thing, and they figured he was just one of those harmless types who'd rather live in a fantasy world but wouldn't actually harm a fly. Now we need to fast forward a little bit. On November 8th, 1992, a 22-year-old woman by the name of Angela Brasso was murdered. Angela was a tech worker who had recently moved to the Phoenix area. She liked to go take a bike ride every evening at sunset. It was like her favorite thing to do. So Angela leaves her house around 7 p.m. for her evening bike ride, but this time her boyfriend Joe decided to stay home so he could bake her a birthday cake. But then he got worried when she was gone longer than usual. So Joe hops on his bike and he goes down to Angela's normal path searching for her. And he actually did that 3 times. He went out there 3 times that night searching for her. Then he reaches out to her family, her friends, asking if anyone has seen her. No one's seen her. No one heard from her. No one knows where she is. So Joe goes to police and reports Angela missing. Angela's headless body was found in a field near the trail that she rode at the Arizona Canal in Phoenix. Her body had been badly mutilated and she was sexually assaulted. 11 days later, a fisherman found Angela's head stuck on a grate in the canal. And it's reported that Angela's head was in quote unquote amazingly good condition, like it was preserved. Angela's purple bike was also missing. Now, remember that mental note that I told you to take? Remember that note that Brian's mom found while he described he was going to decapitate a woman and preserve the head? That was exactly what happened with Angela. Unfortunately, since the police had no other leads, the case went cold for about 10 months. And in September of 1993, 17-year-old Melanie Bernas was reported missing by her mom when she got back home from a dinner date and realized her daughter Melanie hadn't come home by her 10:30 curfew. So her mom calls her friends, sees if anyone knows where she is. Has anyone heard from her? Melanie's close friend Rachel says that she assumed Melanie got caught up with another friend and just forgot to tell her mom where she was, just forgot to check in. Unfortunately, Melanie was found the next day by a local resident by the name of Charlotte Pottle. Charlotte was riding her bike along the canal with her daughter in one of those like baby car seat things that are on the back of the bike. As Charlotte was riding her bike, she rode through this puddle of what she assumed was water, like dirty water or something. and it wound up splashing all over her, like clothes and legs and stuff. But she quickly realized it wasn't water. So she turns around, goes back to the puddle, and realizes it's a puddle of blood. She was fucking horrified, but she got off her bike and decided to take a closer look. Charlotte sees that there's drag marks from the puddle down around a tree leading to the canal. So, of course, she gets back on her bike, goes home, calls the police. The police come and they find Melanie's body. She was found wearing this teal bodysuit, which her friends say she didn't even own. Melanie's good friend Rachel heard about the discovery of a young woman's body on the news later that night, but she was in disbelief that the body the police found was her friend Melanie. The next day at school, Rachel was given terrible news that it was her friend Melanie. And she says, quote, "My time and my life froze at that very moment the day we found out. I made a promise to myself I just never stop talking about her." End quote. Evidence shows the killer somehow got Melanie off the bike and then attacked her from behind. And both stab wounds on her back were in the same position. So, police determined that after Melanie was stabbed, the killer dragged her body to the canal, took off her clothes, and reclothed her in that teal suit or teal bodysuit that she was found in. Melanie had been stabbed, sexually assaulted, and her body had these ritualistic markings all over it. He was also found in the same area as Angela Brasso. Investigators noted that the first stab wounds to each of the women's back were not only fatal, but they were surgically precise. So precise that detectives began to wonder if the killer was a surgeon. Thankfully, police were able to collect DNA from both crime scenes, but the case wound up going cold. Fast forward a little bit, police get an anonymous tip about a man named Bryan Miller in 1994, but they were unable to prove that he was linked to the two murders. So he did remain a suspect on their list, but again, the case went cold. The murder of these two young women went unsolved for decades, which of course created huge panic in Phoenix, and the residents just wanted the person responsible caught like yesterday so they could feel safe again. Jumping to 1999, testing was able to prove that the DNA from both Melanie and Angela came from the same person. But again, the case remains cold. Then in 2000, Brian and his wife Amy moved from Phoenix, Arizona to Washington, and then they had a baby girl. We fast forward a little bit more to May 23rd of 2002. A woman named Melissa Ruiz Ramirez was walking alone one night in Everett, Washington, when a car suddenly pulls up next to her. The driver of the car was Bryan Miller, who she recognized from around the area. He later told police that she'd seen him before talking with one of her friends. According to Melissa, she gets into Brian's car and tells him that she needs to make a phone call. So Brian offered to take her to his job so she could make the phone call from there. A reporter by the name of Morgan Lowe says, quote, "He tells police she's on the phone, and from out of the clear blue, Bryan Miller comes running out with a 12-inch serrated kitchen knife and stabs her in the back. They fight over the weapon." End quote. Melissa somehow manages to escape and then, of course, immediately contacts the police. So Brian was arrested, but he didn't deny stabbing her. He did claim that it was in self defense, though. So Detective Clark, I'm totally going to butcher this last name, Schwarzkopf? I don't know. I'm going to say Detective Clark for the rest of the story. Detective Clark explains Brian's version of events and he says, quote, "He said she goes to use the phone and then all of a sudden, out of the clear blue, he tried to rob him with a knife." End quote. Brian winds up getting charged with first degree assault with a deadly weapon and then spends several months in jail awaiting trial. When the case finally went before a jury that December, things did not go Melissa's way. Detective Clark later said, quote, "The jury just didn't buy Melissa's story. It was a he said, she said, and they acquitted him of the charge." End quote. According to Brian's wife, Amy, something in Brian had shifted after his time in jail. She said she noticed the change while he was still behind bars. He was writing these letters to Amy while he was waiting for trial. And at first, the letters were about proving his innocence. But over time, the tone grew disturbing. Amy stated, quote, "They first started out as professing his innocence, and then it would turn into sexual deviance. Like, here's what I'm going to do when I get out to you." End quote. When Brian finally got released, Amy said those words turned into behavior, and he did exactly what he said he was going to do to her, which, again, we'll get into those details a little bit later. Detective Clark says, quote, "She said he came back with an unbelievable, ugly, dark, sexual, deviant side that she'd never seen before." End quote. Amy describes these moments when Brian's violent impulses start to surface. He says during sex, he would sometimes hold a knife to her throat, tie her up, and used pins and needles on her. Amy also tells detectives that Brian had confided in her about his childhood. Brian said that his mother had done all these terrible things to him when he was a kid, insisting that, quote, his mother had created a monster, end quote. In 2006, Brian and Amy wind up getting a divorce. Fast forward to 2014, when detectives from the Phoenix Police Department attended a DNA conference, and there they met a woman by the name of Colleen Fitzpatrick. Colleen is a badass. She is the forensic scientist and genealogist who co founded the DNA Doe Project. And the work that they do is just amazing. They've helped identify so many unknown victims and perpetrators of violent crimes. Her and her team were able to help identify the remains of the Northwest Flight 4422 crash in Alaska that happened on March 12th of 1948. So again, amazing work. Anyway, at this DNA conference, Colleen tells the police that she can use the Y chromosomes from the DNA that they collected to build a DNA profile of the killer. So the police agree and they send Colleen a sample of the Y chromosome DNA that they found on Angela and Melanie. And with that, Colleen was able to create a DNA profile. Then, using the software her company created, it would take that DNA profile to find a match in the public genealogic databases. After running the sample through the database, Colleen was able to find 6 matches to the last name Miller. By December of 2014, police detectives were still chasing down leads and going through the list of names that Colleen gave them, and one name starts to stand out: Bryan Patrick Miller. What surprised investigators was that Brian wasn't some unknown loner. Around Phoenix, people actually recognized him. He had built this local reputation as, quote unquote, the zombie hunter, which of course was his costume character, and he drove around in his little tricked out car looking like he was straight out of a horror movie. I'll upload the pictures of it and you'll see what I'm talking about. Of course, police decide, hey, we need to keep an eye on this guy. At the time, Brian was working at this Amazon warehouse, and every single day he parked that strange ass, ugly ass zombie hunter car in the same exact spot like clockwork. Detective Clark later states, quote, Brian would come out for his 15-minute break, blast his music really loud. Lunchtime, came out to the car, same thing, blast god awful music, end quote. While they were surveilling Brian, Detective Clark started thinking of a clever way that he could use to get close to Brian and maybe collect some DNA without raising any suspicion. So one afternoon, Detective Clark approached Brian while he was sitting in his ugly ass car and struck up a conversation with him, pretending to be a security consultant. He tells Brian that some nearby warehouses had been dealing with thefts and break-ins, so he asks Brian, quote, would you be interested in working for me as a security officer watching the building while you're outside, end quote. To make it sound real, Detective Clark offers Brian $20 an hour for this job, and that idea appealed to Brian. So on January 2nd, 2015, Detective Clark goes and meets up with Brian at a Chili's restaurant under the pretense of finalizing a job application for the so-called security position. But behind the scenes, the cold case team was ready, waiting to collect anything that Brian might touch so they can get his DNA. Detective Clark stated, quote, they set a table for me and Mr. Miller away from everybody else in a part of the restaurant where nobody else is at, end quote. Brian shows up to the meeting, but he has his daughter with him, which took the undercover team by surprise. They were not expecting that. Apparently, he was a single father now. And Detective Clark states, quote, he was very gentle and caring about his daughter. He often brought his daughter where he would be going, end quote. So the three of them get to the restaurant, they sit down, they order some burgers. When the food came, Detective Clark kept his cool, but he stayed on alert for any chance to collect some DNA. Clark states, quote, he swallows his hamburger in like 5 bites, won't take a drink of his water, and I'm sitting there going, are you sure you don't want something else to drink? You just got water, end quote. Brian replied, quote, no, I'm good, I'm good, I'm good, end quote. So for a while, it looked like the plan might fall apart until Brian finally takes a sip from his glass. Clark states, quote, that's when I knew that, okay, now we've at least got his DNA, end quote. Even with Brian's juvenile record in mind, Detective Clark says that his instincts were telling him something just didn't fit. Clark states, quote, seeing him with his daughter, I just don't see this guy as being the monster in 1992 and 93 that would do this to these women, end quote. So they finish their lunch, and then Brian gives Detective Clark a little tour of his freaky ass zombie hunter car, and then the two part ways. So police take the glass that Brian drank from, and it was sent to the lab quick, fast, and in a hurry. And 11 days later, Detective Clark gets the call he has been waiting for. The lab results were in. So he goes to meet with the director of the lab, and she leans in and says, quote, "It's him," end quote. Detective Clark says that he was shocked, and he asks, quote, "What?" end quote. The director repeated, quote, "Bryan Miller, it's him," end quote. Clark says that he could feel the blood drain from his head, and he says, quote, "You've got to be kidding," end quote. Detective Clark tells 48 Hours he really wanted to eliminate Brian because he thought he was the wrong guy. Clark says, quote, "I was really more about just getting his DNA, clearing him, and moving on. Because of my conversation with him, he was the last person I ever thought would be responsible for this. He was mild-mannered," end quote. When Clark was asked if Brian seemed like he was physically intimidating, Clark says, quote, "He's a bigger guy, but he's more soft. Big enough to where he could certainly overpower women, but not someone you'd be really scared of on the street," end quote. The DNA from Brian's glass does match both sets of DNA collected from Angela and Melanie, and within hours, Bryan Patrick Miller, the so called zombie hunter, was arrested. When detectives finally sat Brian down for questioning, they didn't waste any time. They got straight to the point and told him that his DNA was linked to the murders of Angela and Melanie. Brian somehow seems shocked. He says, quote, "I don't see how that's possible," end quote. And then he maintains his innocence, insisting over and over that he didn't kill anyone. Investigators, of course, get a search warrant for Brian's home where he lived with his teenage daughter. Detective Clark says that he remembers the scene vividly. Clark states, quote, "I can remember like it was yesterday, walking up to the front door and everybody going, 'You can't get in that way. It's full of crap,' end quote." The house was described as something you would see straight out of that show, Hoarders. It was overflowing with clutter. Detective Clark says, quote, "There was a little pass where you could get to a bathroom and the kitchen and where the TV was, and that was it. Everything else is just stacked to the roof with garbage," end quote. And I'll upload a picture of the house. That description is accurate as fuck. So, anyway, Clark and his team begin the painstaking process of digging through all that shit, searching for clues and evidence. But then a new lead surfaces, one that came straight from Brian himself. During his interview, he mentioned somebody that he clearly had some unresolved anger towards. Brian says to detectives, quote, "It's the one person on the face of the earth I could possibly honestly say I hate," end quote. That person was his ex-wife, Amy. Amy goes on to tell Detective Clark that she met Brian in 1996 when she was 19. They got married within a year and then they moved to Washington. But she soon discovered there was a darker side to Brian. Amy says Brian had once admitted to her that he killed a young girl in Phoenix years before they met. According to Detective Clark, Amy says that she never went to the police because, quote, "she didn't know if it was true. She was afraid of Miller and she said she wanted to be a good wife," end quote. Amy tells police that Brian had said a young girl had came to his door, he grabbed the young female, pulled her in, and then killed her immediately. And he also claims that Brian said he dismembered the girl and then disposed of her remains in household trash. Now, Amy didn't know the name of the little girl, but her story did give investigators enough clues to identify who it could have been. They believe that Brian was describing 13-year-old Brandy Myers, who was a schoolgirl who disappeared in 1992 while she was out collecting donations for a reading fundraiser in her Phoenix neighborhood. Brandy's sister, Kristen Dennis, says, quote, "I was a tomboy and she was a girly girl, so she would try to learn to climb trees or jump fences because she wanted to play with me. She was my best friend," end quote. So on May 26, 1992, Brandy went out to collect money for her bookathon and then never came home. At the time, Ryan was living just a few houses away in that halfway home after serving the time for aggravated assault against Chelsea Bentley. So Kristen says, quote, "This was 1 block from our school, his home, and then 3 blocks is our house. So every single day we walked right by there," end quote. Brandy was last seen only 2 doors down from Brian's house, walking right in his direction, and then she vanished. Despite their searches, Brandy Myers' body was never found. Still, Detective Clark later stated that even though Amy didn't have the name of the little girl, her story fit perfectly. All the details pointed to the conclusion that it had to be Brandy. Unfortunately, the police didn't have enough evidence to charge Brian with Brandy's murder. In January of 2015, 21 years after the Canal murders, Bryan Patrick Miller was finally charged with the 2 counts of first-degree murder for the deaths of Angela Brasso and Melanie Bernas. When the news broke, Melanie's friend Rachel says that she felt both shock and relief. She states, quote, "Oh my gosh, this is what we've been waiting for decades upon decades," end quote. The show 48 Hours reaches out to Bryan and asks him about the disappearance of Brandy, and he claims that he had nothing to do with it and that he never told his wife he killed a young girl. So let's talk about the trial. Bryan waives his right to a jury trial, and his defense team claims that due to his childhood trauma, he has dissociative disorders. And in case you didn't see it coming, Bryan pled not guilty by reason of insanity. The defense argued that Bryan didn't remember the attacks due to the abuse from his mother when he was a kid. Bryan says that his mother began to brutally beat him when he was about 5 years old. Now, remember, she was a detention officer, and Bryan claims that she often used her security belt to beat him, using the buckle part of the belt to hit him. He also says that his mother had this fascination with violent sex and would expose him to violent films and pornography. Prosecutors worked their asses off to challenge Bryan's defense team and their claims that he had no memory of the Canal murders, pointing out that he clearly recalled other stabbings from his past. Bryan had admitted to stabbing Celeste Bentley when he was 16, and in 2002, he also testified about the attack on Melissa Ruiz Ramirez in Washington. So this suggests that he wasn't incapable of remembering violent acts that he committed. In order to paint the picture of Bryan's dangerous tendencies, prosecutors called the one person that Bryan himself said he hated his ex-wife, Amy. Now, the judge wouldn't allow any video recordings of Amy's face, but when she was questioned by prosecutor Elizabeth Reamer, Amy testified about Bryan's behavior later on in their marriage, explaining how Bryan became increasingly violent during sex. Amy says that she never asked Bryan to stop because she didn't want to make him mad. She says, quote, "was avoiding any confrontation with him at all at that point and wanted to be as compliant as possible so that I would say, will he love me enough not to kill me?" End quote. During the trial, psychologist Bethany Brand says, quote, "he feels like there are different TVs playing in his head," end quote. Bethany testified that Bryan developed a condition known as dissociative amnesia, which is the inability to remember some traumatic events. Now, Bryan never took the stand during the trial, but his defense argued that he wasn't evil, he was broken. That shit didn't side with the judge. The judge did take his childhood trauma into account, but in January of 2022, he was found fit to stand trial. After a 6-month trial and questioning 36 witnesses, Bryan Miller was found guilty in April of 2023. And it's reported that Bryan had no emotional reaction to the verdict whatsoever. Maricopa County Attorney Rachel Mitchell says, quote, "obviously this has been a long time coming for the victims. I'm glad that our office could bring some measure of justice," end quote. Reporter Lowe says, quote, "there were 2 Bryans. There's the one you see over there at the defense table, who's a fairly normal person who has friends, who had a job, who was a dad, who was a husband, and then there's the killer. There's Bad Bryan," end quote. Maricopa County Superior Court Judge Susan Cohen states, quote, "the defendant did not just murder them, he brutalized them," end quote. The families of Angela and Melanie were given a moment to address the court. Angela's mother says, quote, "the defendant broke my heart, took all hope and light from me and my family. The hole in my heart is so big and empty," end quote. Melanie's mother, Jill, says, quote, "for 30 years now, we've had to live without Melanie because the defendant murdered her. Words cannot even begin to describe the level of excruciating pain we experienced with the news of her horrific death," end quote. When Bryan addresses the court, he states, quote, "I am not looking for sympathy today. This time is for the family and friends of the victims. I cannot imagine the pain they have endured for all these years. I know I'm different. I thought it had to do with what my mother did to me," end quote. Defense attorney R.J. Parker addresses Judge Cohen saying, quote, "you do not have to kill Bryan in order to see justice done," end quote. So Judge Cohen did agree that the defense was able to prove the abuse Bryan suffered as a child at the hands of his mother. However, 8 months after the trial, Judge Cohen sentenced Bryan Patrick Miller to death. He states, quote, "there is no question that what the defendant did deserves the death penalty," end quote. When asked if Bryan had anything to say about his sentence, he says, quote, "I guess thanks listening to everything that was said and giving us at least the opportunity to try and convince you otherwise," end quote. Detective Clark says justice was served. Phoenix Police spokesman Sergeant Trent Crump says, quote, "these were 2 brutal, horrific murders that shocked the community at the time. People didn't feel safe taking a walk or going for a bike ride. We're just glad we were able to solve this after so many years, end quote. Melanie's close friend Rachel states, quote, just knowing that justice was served, it doesn't make anything easier, end quote. When she was asked how she would like people to remember her friend, she says, quote, I want her family to know that we haven't forgotten her. She changed us all for the better. It was a gift, end quote. After he was sentenced, Bryan was contacted via email by the producer of 48 Hours. And yes, prisoners do have access to email. Bryan tells 48 Hours he didn't commit either murder. When he was asked about how his DNA wound up on Melanie and Angela, Bryan states, quote, that's the $1 million question. If I had a provable answer for that, I wouldn't be in this situation now, would I? It's a question that I would like answered, and everyone is so convinced that I did it, so it will go unanswered, end quote. 48 Hours producer asks Bryan about his experience on death row. Bryan replies, quote, it is better than county jail, but it is obvious that isolation has taken its toll on many people here. From what I saw of people in county jail compared to here, the majority of people here are by far not what I would consider the worst of the worst. It is by far safer than anywhere else in the prison, even though they have nothing really to lose anymore. It is far from great, as I'm even more isolated from those I care about and also my legal team. The food is still not great, and the cells are getting very cold now that temps are falling, end quote. Bryan says how he disagrees with the trial, stating, quote, how is a person supposed to defend themselves and prove anything for a crime that happened decades ago, end quote. He also disagrees with the psychologist who testified that he doesn't remember killing anyone because of the dissociative amnesia. Bryan again says, quote, I maintain I did not do the murders, end quote. Apparently, Bryan had a really good relationship with his daughter and treated her really well. And he says, quote, what I miss most is spending time with my daughter and friends, end quote. Police say that they also suspect Bryan was responsible for other stabbings that occurred when he was younger, but they have no solid evidence against him to prove it. Bryan Patrick Miller sits on death row at Eman Prison Complex in Florence, Arizona, and because of Arizona's death penalty laws, Bryan's death sentence will automatically be appealed. And that, my friends, is the story of Bryan Patrick Miller, the zombie hunter. Now, it's time to debrief and discuss. What do we think? I personally don't have any doubt that he actually killed those four girls, but does he really not remember committing the murders? You think that's possible? As I've said in past episodes, I do not have any empathy or sympathy for the adult version of people like Bryan once they decide to do these terrible things. But I do understand and empathize with the child version of him, the abused child, the neglected child. I completely understand that part. However, can you really justify being a rapist and a murderer by claiming it's due to your childhood trauma? Now, yes, of course, I know and fully believe that abuse and trauma, especially in childhood, changes you. It kind of shapes you. I get that. I'm not debating that. But how is it possible that some people who've experienced childhood trauma and abuse wind up suffering from anxiety, depression, other mental and emotional disorders? But then there's other people who cross that line into rape, torture, murder. I don't understand that part. And I have a very hard time saying that because you went through this as a child, it makes it okay for you to go out and murder people and commit these horrific crimes. It just boggles my mind, and it's something that I just can't wrap my head around. I don't get it. Anyway, feel free to give me any thoughts and theories about this story or any new story suggestions. As always, stay curious, stay safe, and remember, an apple a day keeps the motherfucking murders away. Goodbye.